Hello, everyone. Welcome to Conservation Voters New Mexico's annual pre-legislative briefing. As people get signed on, we're just going to go through a few of the Zoom protocols. Probably everybody's very used to them by now, but just in case. First of all, this is our annual pre-legislative briefing exclusively for CVNM members. So if you've made a contribution and or taken an action, such as signing a petition or writing a letter to the editor, in the past year and a half, you're a member, and we thank you for being a conservation voter. We're very grateful for your support and engagement. It all keeps this work going. So during the event today, all participants will be muted to avoid background distractions. If you have any technical difficulty or you have feedback for the speakers, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. This will send your message directly to us. At the end of the speaking portion, we'll have about 20 minutes to answer your questions. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Questions will either be answered directly through that Q&A function, or they'll be directed to the panel to answer live during our Q&A session at the close. And thank you for joining us this morning. Now I'm going to hand the mic over to CVNM's Executive Director, Denise Foster, to begin our program. Denise.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks for organizing this online event for us. Really appreciate it. And thanks for everyone who has joined us today as we gear up for this really big 30-day session. We think it might be the biggest 30-day session for CVNM. A lot has changed since our founder, Sally Rogers, started this organization over 50 years ago. And became the first woman lobbyist in the state of New Mexico. Even more has changed since Governor Lujan Grisham took the helm in January of 2019. And even more has changed since we secured conservation majorities in both chambers of the New Mexico Legislature. We went from just being an organization that was known for killing every bad environmental bill that came through the building for over a decade with one full-time lobbyist working on that throughout every session, to having a full expanded lobby team working with the administration, working with our allies and community members to do proactive legislation, which is actually a lot harder than killing bills. Working with the administration on the budget, and also working on the executive order on climate and the 30 by 30 campaign to protect our land, water, wildlife, and natural heritage that was signed in August of last year. We have a full team now that is working year round on environmental issues. For those who might not be familiar with us, we now have a much larger lobby team. We also are joined by some veteran consultants this year, including Doug Micklejohn, for those of you who know him, who's really been a part of the legislature and lobby effort for environmental justice since the 80s. We also have former Speaker of the House, Raymond Sanchez, on our lobby team. And we have a full-time bill analyst as well, and also communication support, and all the components that we will really need to go in and be successful in this session. For those of you who might not know our process, we analyze every single bill that gets filed for its environmental impact on our communities. We have a full-time bill analyst during the session that does that for us. So then we can decide, which bills are priority bills for us. We also work proactively on bills that we want to get through, and with our allies and community members. And once we determine the bills that have the most impact, we put together a legislative agenda. That legislative agenda has bills that we both oppose and support. Some we double weight as priorities. And we send that out to the entire legislative body so they can see why we want them to vote a certain way on a bill. And we have a full narrative. We also work one-on-one with our legislative body to make sure they know why we're opposing or supporting a bill. We work really closely with committee chairs Since 2005, we have really secured a majority in both chambers. I mean, right now we have around 43 members of both chambers that are absolutely 100% dependable that we partner with all the time, and many, many, many other allies. So it's really a great partnership. Once we have that legislative agenda, you can go to our website, you can pull it up, you can look at all the bills, you can follow where they're going. You'll see what committees they're going to. And then we actually track every single vote on our agenda. So we, the double weighted ones get more weight. Once we finish that up, we come up with our CV&M scorecard. The scorecard, as members, you get a copy of the scorecard before anybody else. We send it to you. It gives a score for every single legislator on how they did in the session. And then you can go to our website and you can see every single bill, how they voted on it. And we have the full history of their voting records on there as well. So they also have a lifetime score. That scorecard informs our elections. This is a huge election year. Our governor's up. We have lots of statewide offices, land commissioner, and the entire House is up this year. So we are headed into a very large 2022. I'd like to hand it over now to our advocacy team so they can really dig in and give you a preview of what we're working on, already working on. Ben Shelton is our political and policy director. He's been our long time leader in the Roundhouse. He oversees our team, and I'm going to hand over to him so he can dig right in with all of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Denise. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. I'm going to talk quickly about some items in the budget that are kind of interest, because that's been sort of popping lately, and it's happening as we speak. And then I will talk a little bit about some of our high-level information about what's making this session particularly unusual, and then some of our higher level legislative priorities. Starting with the budget, every single year the budget dynamic is very similar. The governor proposes something up here, and the LFC kind of counters with something down here. It's been an issue for natural resource regulators like the Environment Department and Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department for a while, because they have been in the process of sort of almost for a decade now of trying to rebuild from the teardown during the Martinez years. And that has been a very, very gradual process in it. So it's always sort of frustrating to see that low number coming from LFC. That's a background existing issue every single year. The ability for these agencies to protect just the basic things that everybody assumes that they're already doing, like protecting clean air, protecting clean water, is a challenge. This year, it's been sort of especially frustrating because there is an extra tier that the executive wants to really reach for this year that is reflected in that budget. And those are in the form of really proactive climate action. We're seeing both of those agencies, NNERD and NMED, look to create climate bureaus to start addressing really proactively some of the big questions that we have yet to wrestle with as a state. Things like, how do we track greenhouse emissions from every economic sector of the state? What kind of rules do we need in place to start getting those emissions down, getting them down quickly? These are complicated ideas that would require, a few extra people, and we are seeing a really, really big gap between what the executive thinks they need from that and what LFC thinks that they ought to have. As an example, the Environment Department asked for 14 people to start this climate bureau, which itself might be low, in my opinion. The LFC budget kind of has countered so far with like maybe 3, maybe more, if depending on if the hydrogen bill, which is kind of its own fraught concept, passes. So this is some of the stuff that we've been tracking kind of very closely in the budget process. I would say that going forward, getting these agencies ready infrastructurally to deal with climate issues, big complicated climate issues, is kind of the concrete that you build the house on, because we're going to need to think about big complicated investments in things like clean cars, energy efficiency, building efficiency, grid upgrade, grid modernization. All of that is still in front of us. So getting these agencies resourced and looking the way they need to look, it should be the basics. So certainly frustrating a little bit in the budget session, but I'm confident that we're going to get to a really good place on that. What we have on our side is overwhelming public opinion that this should be a priority for state government. We have legislators who understand that priority and understand that public opinion, and when the governor and the legislature have gotten together to do things, they've made some real progress on climate in the last few years in her first term. So I'm confident we can keep that going. This is a little bit of an unusual session. This is a short session, which would be usually reserved for primarily the budget and then a few things kind of around the periphery. This governor has decided that a few things around the periphery is not going to do it this year, which we are certainly kind of benefiting from in certain ways. It's a little bit of a double-edged sword always, but I think that we have the privilege of operating a legislative agenda under two really, really exciting executive orders that sort of set the roadmap for what we're going to be working on. The first is the governor's 2019 executive order on climate. And the second is the last year's 30 by 30 executive order on conservation and lands, which sets out to protect 30% of lands in New Mexico by 2030. So those have both led to a lot of momentum and some really, really interesting legislation. On the conservation space, we're seeing the governor sort of propose, really for the first time ever in New Mexico, a general obligation bond to protect public lands, to really start thinking about ways that we can get some consistent funding for conservation, which is kind of very rural economic development focused, if you kind of want to think about it that way. That really hasn't happened in New Mexico before. And it's outside of the general fund allocation process. So that sort of frustrating budget two-step that I described, if we can get this go bond process right for conservation, we get to step outside that. Greg is going to talk to you in a little bit about some of the details of that bond and what's in there and what the benefits of that might be. And then other things, some tweaks that we are working on to help the state access federal matching dollars for conservation, which is something we let millions and millions of dollars in the state pass us by. That would be available to come in and invest here and do all sorts of important work, but because we don't designate state matching funds, we just don't claim it. So Greg will talk to you a little bit about that as well. On the climate side, one of the unusual things about this year is we're doing a pretty big climate bill this year. Last year in October at the Speaker's Climate Summit, the governor announced that we were going to be working on really, really ambitious economy-wide greenhouse gas limits beginning this year, 2022. So we have learned in the coming months that that's actually not just a single year of legislation. This is going to be a 2-year legislative arc composing a couple really significant pieces of climate legislation. Obviously, the shorter piece in the short session, the longer, a little more fleshed out piece in the second in 2023 in that long session. This is really kind of building on the arc. So you can think of the narrative arc on the governor's climate agenda that began with the Energy Transition Act in 2019. What we are looking at is taking sort of some of the principles around transition from the Energy Transition Act and expanding it to the rest of the economy. So that is going to be exciting. Sammy's going to tell you a little bit more about what's going on in that bill. And then also some stuff that deals with low-income energy efficiency, as well as just some tweaks and changes to the way that we are regulating energy or electricity providers based on incorporating some lessons that we've learned from COVID around the way that people struggle with their power bill, the way the PRC can better regulate some of our utilities in the state. So there's a bill that would sort of as a centerpiece create a grants program for low-income energy efficiency grants around the state. Sammy will be talking to you a little bit more about that. It is a very, very full substantive legislative agenda for a short session. This is not the budget and change. This is some pretty meaty items on there. So it's going to be a very, very busy session for us, but we're excited. As Denise mentioned, we are a lot more robust as an advocacy team and unit than we have been in quite a long time. So I'm excited to get going with that. I think what I would like to do at this point is introduce Greg Peters, who is our senior advocate for public lands, water, and wildlife, and he's going to talk a little bit about the bond and some of the other bills that we're working on this year.
Thanks, Ben. As New Mexico works to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic and turn its attention to economic recovery, the state should strive to invest dollars in a manner that creates jobs, drives the economy, protects our natural and cultural resources, and provides greater equity and access to nature for our communities. Investing in conservation, restoration, and outdoor recreation infrastructure would achieve all these goals while delivering long-term health and quality of life benefits for current and future generations. There are a number of potential public funding sources that can be woven together to conserve lands and waters in New Mexico. State, federal, local, and private conservation programs each have a role to play to help achieve conservation objectives. At the heart of the most successful state conservation programs is a substantial, long-term dedicated source of state revenue. With a reliable source of funds, we can establish meaningful conservation priorities that protect the most valuable resources, are geographically distributed, equitable, and otherwise meet important statewide goals and values. We will be advancing several funding priorities, as Ben mentioned, during the upcoming 2022 legislative session, and today I'll provide a quick overview of these priorities. First is a general obligation bond for conservation. So first is, what is a GO bond? GO bonds are essentially loans taken out by a government secured by the jurisdiction's full faith, credit, and taxing power to make timely payments. Borrowing by issuing bonds presents a number of opportunities, including that it can provide the state with revenue and flexibility it needs to provide upfront to fund large-scale park and open space projects, and land is available when it's less expensive than it will be in the future. Bonds ensure that a steady stream of funding that is not dependent on the fluctuations of the operating budget. And also, costs are typically spread out over a long time horizon, creating minimal financial burden, only a few dollars a year per household from what New Mexican residents already pay in existing property taxes. At the state level, there's generally some stiff competition for GO bonds among many programs in need of financing. Here in New Mexico, general obligation bonds are usually used to fund projects that will serve the public community, such as roads and infrastructure, schools, libraries, and community and senior centers. This past year, New Mexico increased its bonding authority and included conservation as an allowable investment. And this will allow proposed bonds for conservation to be included on the ballot without reducing bond capacity for these other important uses. This will allow New Mexico to invest in conservation in a big, meaningful way. While general obligation bonds have not been used in New Mexico at the state level to fund conservation and recreation initiatives, they are generally used by other states across the nation and at the local level here in the state. For instance, since 1988, there have been 60 different conservation bond initiatives put before voters in other states. 51 of those passed. Those measures enjoyed strong support from voters, with nearly 65% of voters voting yes to approve nearly $43 billion in funding. The same is true for local bond measures that have been put before voters here in New Mexico. Since 1988, there have been 16 measures on the ballot at the city and county levels, including 2 that passed in Albuquerque in the most recent local election. Those measures have enjoyed similarly strong support from voters, with more than 70% voting yes to approve more than $80 million in funding. So this brings us to the Land of Enchantment Bond. In November, Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham announced, in coordination with MNERD, that the administration will pursue much needed funding for state conservation programs through a GO bond. This unprecedented community-centered funding proposal, if approved by the state legislature and voters, would support jobs across the state, give access to federal conservation funding, provide equitable outdoor opportunities for all New Mexicans, provide and work to help protect natural lands and working lands for future generations. This proposal would provide multi-year funding that we could go after in future years, and it allows New Mexico to build muscle memory with voters, allowing them to get into the habit of approving it. Conservation General Obligation Bond will provide much needed resources to state agency programs and establish a precedent for additional bond funding in future years. So how does the proposal work? Well, it calls for a $50 million general obligation bond that would be distributed among several state agencies and supplement existing programs aimed at providing direct benefits to New Mexicans, including reducing wildfire risks, restoring forests and watersheds, expanding outdoor recreation opportunities, including hunting, fishing, hiking, and camping, improving wildlife habitat and carbon sequestration through responsible land management, expanding and improving state parks, and enhancing partnerships and supporting conservation and landscape improvement initiatives on private working lands and traditional communities. The Land of Enchantment Bond, as now, will be included in the Capital Outlay General Obligation Bond bill during the legislative session. And hopefully, once passed by the legislature, the bond proposal will be decided by New Mexicans on a statewide ballot in November. So why now? In the face of a changing climate, we must take care of our lands and waters, and building on the resilience of our natural resources is essential to ensuring water security and economic prosperity now into the future. Drought, heat, and longer and more intense wildfire seasons are already taking their toll. So by investing in effective land management practices today, we can prevent the worst impacts of climate change and preserve our traditional land uses. Unfortunately, our state natural resource agencies saw devastating budget cuts prior to 2019, making it nearly impossible to consistently fund many of the programs that protect and preserve our lands and waters, making this Land of Enchantment Bond even more necessary. A bipartisan team of pollsters recently conducted a poll among 2022 voters, likely 2022 voters in the state of New Mexico. And this survey shows a large and diverse majority support for a GO bond in support of land and water conservation, reflecting voters' commitments to land, water, and heritage of the state. By nearly 2-to-1 margin, likely New Mexican voters embraced the general obligation bond supporting conservation. This financial commitment by the administration underscores the priorities voters support to protect our lands, waters, and communities across the state. So with that, the second legislative priority I'll be speaking about is proposed tweaks and reforms to the Natural Heritage Conservation Act, or NHCA, which is an existing program created in 2010 that is overseen by Emory. The program was designed to provide grants to state agencies, communities, tribes, land grants, acequias, and other political subdivisions for conservation purposes. NHCA gives New Mexico many of the tools needed to protect our natural resources and outdoor way of life. However, after an initial investment after the act was passed in 2010, the program failed to receive funding under the Martinez administration and has not been funded since. Modernizing and reforming the NHCA will ensure New Mexico has the ability to create new parks and open spaces, restore our lands and watersheds, support traditional communities, expand public access, bolster rural outdoor economies, and offer voluntary conservation easements for landowners, and restore habitat, water resources, and working lands. As an example, amending NHCA would help support acquisitions of small properties, such as an acequia on private lands near Taos. Somebody like the county or the Acequia Association could acquire that land from a willing seller, which would allow for a fence around the irrigation headgate. This parcel is also adjacent to Forest Service land, so it would provide a place for folks to connect to the trail, which goes all the way to Angel Fire. We feel that New Mexico lawmakers can create substantial conservation achievements through small technical fixes to this Natural Heritage Conservation Act. The proposed legislation for the 2022 session would take a surgical approach to amend NHCA by adding acquisition authority to the program, allowing it to meet requirements for federal conservation grants. There's an important new source of federal funding available to New Mexico from the recently fully funded Land and Water Conservation Fund, or LWCF. And the proposed changes to NHCA would make the state program a workable solution for local communities, particularly for tribes in rural areas to access this LWCF matching funds necessary to build new parks and open spaces and increase access to the outdoors. So just briefly, a little background on LWCF. The Land and Water Conservation Fund is a voluntary program administered by the Department of the Interior that provides federal grants to local communities for conservation and recreation projects. The funding is federal, but LWCF grants are administered by the New Mexico State Parks Division. With a 60-year history of the program, over $100 million and 1,000 projects have been completed in New Mexico, covering every county and district in the state. Last year, we reached a new inflection point with the LWCF program, and thanks to the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act, New Mexico is poised to receive $5 million in annual LWCF applications, which represents a 5-fold increase in new funding. However, all this new federal funding requires a 1-to-1 non-federal match. Each year, New Mexico misses out on approximately $20 million in federal funds for land and water conservation projects, including grants to protect working farms and ranches. These projects are critical to protecting New Mexico's natural and cultural heritage. So by creating a fund dedicated to conservation efforts, New Mexico is capitalizing on a major opportunity to draw resources to the state. The updates in this bill paired with state funding are imperative to jumpstarting LWCF conservation projects across the state. So it's a straightforward good governance bill that provides technical fixes to the existing program, providing more tools for our state agencies, and providing New Mexico landowners and land managers voluntary opportunities to manage and care for their lands. It will also provide direct investments into communities across the state, providing greater equity to our tribes, pueblos, traditional, underserved, and frontline communities. The NHCA bill received bipartisan support when the legislation was passed originally in 2010, and there's been extensive stakeholder outreach at the time. We believe this legislation is ripe and feasible for a 30-day session, and is an essential incremental step towards dedicated long-term funding for conservation programs. Legislation introduced by Representative Cristina Ortez during the 2021 regular session would have provided similar reforms to NHCA. That bill passed through the House during the session, but was never scheduled for a hearing in Senate Judiciary. We have asked that Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham add narrow NHCA reform legislation to the governor's call for the upcoming session, and will be priority legislation for our team. So with that, that was a basic overview of 2 of our funding priorities. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Ben. Ben?
Thanks, Greg, for that thorough rundown. I think next I will kick it over to Sammy Cow, our climate and energy advocate, to run through just a couple of the pretty exciting climate bills that we're working on this year. Go ahead, Sammy.
Thanks, Ben. Hello, friends. We have a good number of bills to be really excited about for this session in the climate energy world. And I'm going to be talking about two of our highest priorities on that list for this coming session. The most exciting, of course, is the governor's climate bill, the Zero Emissions Economy Act, or as I'll call it, the Z bill. Like Ben said earlier, in October 2021, Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham announced at the climate summit that she's going to be putting comprehensive climate legislation on her call for this 2022 session, which is a year sooner than we had expected. And also, like Ben mentioned, the Z bill will codify the governor's climate executive order to eliminate, specifically to eliminate our state's greenhouse gas emissions. The first emissions target set forth in the bill is to decrease our emissions to 50% of 2005 levels. And by 2015, New Mexico will be set to have zero greenhouse gas emissions. In addition to this 2030-2050 timeline, the bill has 4 key substantive elements to get New Mexico on track to achieve a zero emissions economy. The first one is the bill sets forth how the state will actually determine the 2005 emission levels so that we can be at 50% of whatever that is. And this will be done by requiring every state agency to report key climate change elements to the Department of Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources, or as I'll be calling it MNERD. These key elements are how climate change impacts that agency's work, the agency, what the agency will do to include climate change mitigation methods into its operations, the agency's current emissions levels within their jurisdiction, and finally, what resources the agency will need to reduce emissions to meet our targets. The section briefly highlights the bill's focus on community equity, which I really like. The bill uses the term disproportionately impacted community, which was coined in one of the bills that passed last year, one of our priority bills, the Sustainable Economy Task Force. They use this term in regards to how the agencies will be reporting on how their operations affect the local communities. Just as a refresher, the definition of disproportionately impacted communities means disadvantaged communities or populations of people for which multiple burdens, including environmental and socioeconomic stressors, inequity, poverty, high unemployment, pollution, or discrimination, may act to persistently and negatively affect the health, well-being, and environment of the communities or populations. So with this data that the state agencies will report to MNERD, MNERD will publish an annual report that will include impacts on these disproportionately impacted communities, as well as the amount of greenhouse gas emissions statewide. The report also includes strategies and policies to achieve our greenhouse gas emissions targets. And then the report will also identify what new programs are necessary to hit our emissions targets. Examples of these new programs are outlined in the bill, and these include programs to have more low and zero emissions vehicles, updating the building and energy efficiency codes, and creating opportunities for low-income homes to improve on their energy efficiency, which I will discuss more in the next bill, so stay tuned. Personally, I appreciate all the inclusion of these examples in the bill language because it shows the intent of the administration to get these programs up and running this year, which is very, very exciting. So the second key element in the bill is the power and the duties delegated to MNERD to seek out the necessary resources in order to achieve our zero emissions goals. It puts also the responsibility of achieving these goals on MNERD. The third element of the bill is that it proposes amendments to the Air Quality Act. And these amendments include things like broadening the powers and duties of the Environmental Improvement Board, or the EIB, to regulate their greenhouse gas emissions, such that New Mexico can hit our 2030 and 2050 goals. And finally, this bill creates a state climate fund, And this money will, of course, go towards relevant agencies to enforce the greenhouse gas reduction rules created and promulgated by the Environmental Improvement Board. So this bill obviously carries a great deal of weight, and the fine print and details of how and when things will unfold are expected to be ironed out later this year and into next year. This 2022 session, like Ben mentioned earlier, is focused on setting the mandates for greenhouse gas emissions and the targets for 2030 and 2050. And essentially it's setting up the process for the administration to come out with the all-encompassing, completely comprehensive climate bill in 2023. In 2023, we plan to iron out all the details for which agency does what and to what extent, and so on and so forth. So if it sounds like a two-step process, it's because it is. So moving on to our second priority bill, the Community Energy Efficiency Development Block Grant Act, or as I will call it, the SEED Act. This bill's purpose is to improve utility affordability, reduce the energy burden on our low-income homes, and then increase utility access to low-income New Mexicans, especially those who live in rural and underserved communities of the state. Many of these New Mexicans are paying upwards of 15% of their monthly income to energy and utility bills. So by making their homes more energy efficient, it reduces their energy bills. It also improves the quality of their homes, and then it helps New Mexico ultimately hit our zero emissions goals. We're particularly hopeful for this bill, and the one reason is because the money for the bill is there. This bill called for $10 million, and this request was included in the LFC budget, which was a little bit limited in the climate provisions. So this means we just have one less obstacle to get past. We have one less obstacle to get this bill passed. This bill has three main provisions. The first is requiring utility companies to report on utility arrears, disconnections, and how much access New Mexicans have to the said utility. The New Mexico Public Regulation Commission, or the PRC, will be required to hold hearings to make sure that we're holding utility companies accountable for things like rate increases or disconnections and issues with access. The second provision sets forth the goal to achieve 100% energy affordability for all low-income New Mexicans by the year 2050. And finally, the bill gives the PRC the authority to approve low-income energy bills at reduced rates. So that's it for me. I'll hand it back over to Ben.
Thanks, Sammy. I think we're about to go over to Michael for some Q&A. Before I do, and then Sammy, if you wouldn't mind dumping the number for you for the C block bill in the chat, because I believe that is pre-filed. But before we do, I just want to clarify that this, we talked about these four bills today because these are the bills we know the best and we've been working on the longest at CB&M. We will be working on everything. If you did not hear a bill that get described today that you feel like is a priority, be that the Green Amendment or anything related to water, because boy, do we need some more work, a lot more work on water. Know that if there are bills out there, if there are budget items, we will be working on it. We will be supporting it as much as we absolutely possibly can with every resource we've got at our disposal to get all this stuff across the finish line. We just can't, monopolize all y'all's time for 3 hours to talk through every single thing. So we have to kind of pick four, but there's a lot out there. There's a lot of good stuff. Last year we saw kind of an exciting situation, especially in the last week of the session, where good bills were just ripping off the floor. And so that was really exciting as you think about the number of things that even are out there this year. I think that there are the possibility to pass a lot of really good things exists in this political climate, in this legislature that really hasn't. I mean, I've been with CB&M since 2015, and I never saw anything like what he had happen last year, just in terms of stuff coming up and moving off the floor in that last week. So plenty of reason to be excited about lots of bills that we did not get to here. With that said, I think I'll kick it over to Michael to open the Q&A and start farming out questions. Go ahead, Michael.